Welcome to my TED Talk. Hello guys, my name's Jasmine and I'm an illustrator, and today I'm going to answer a very important question, mostly because I get asked this a lot, so I figured I'd make a video finally answering why it is that I don't use Photoshop. Full disclaimer, this is strictly my opinion as far as my experience with Photoshop, all the Adobe products, and Clip Studio Paint, so take this as a grain of salt and strictly anecdotal, but it could still be a useful opinion because if you're broke and a 2D illustrator, this might be a helpful video for you, so stay tuned. Now, I feel like before I start touting why I don't use Photoshop and kind of spilling the tea, I believe I should tell you a little bit context of how it is that I even ended up here, because that's important. So for many years, all the way back to high school, I've been using Photoshop, and it wasn't until they switched to a subscription service that I finally had the opportunity to really question why it is that I was using Photoshop in the first place, because as we will explore deeper into the actual software, we'll see that it's not entirely ideal for the purposes of illustration, or at least how I illustrate and how many artists illustrate, and they're not even aware of how Photoshop really isn't ideal for you. When Adobe switched to their horrible subscription service, I wasn't working as a full-time artist, so I literally could not afford to have to be paying a subscription service. In doing some research, I discovered a program called Clip Studio Paint. It seemed a little too good to be true because it was only $50, a lump sum kind of purchase. You have it forever. It wasn't always Clip Studio Paint. It was actually Manga Studio. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the name of that software. I was aware of it. I even considered getting it one day, but Photoshop has always been used in the industry, so I really thought that I should be using Photoshop. But Manga Studio no longer exists. They rebranded into Clip Studio Paint. Not entirely sure why they rebranded, but now it's even more of a mouthful to pronounce. Clip Studio Paint, Clip Studio Paint, Clip Studio Paint. So I'm going to list just a few key things of why Clip Studio Paint is superior to Photoshop for a very specific type of illustrator. Now, if you're a concept artist or a graphic designer, obviously no, like you should stick to Photoshop because that's what it's designed for. But if you're drawing digitally, Clip Studio Paint really does have some superior features that might make you reconsider why you're still paying that subscription for Photoshop. The first thing as to why Clip Studio is kind of better than Photoshop in this very specific particular situation is that it's cheaper. So there's two versions of Clip Studio Paint, the Pro and the EX. Don't ask me why the Pro is not the higher one, it's not. But the Pro is sort of the lesser version of the program, and it's only $50. You basically have all of the features that you need to make 2D illustrations. For the EX version, you actually unlock more features to be able to make comics and even do some animation. If you're considering just basic illustration like drawing digitally and painting, the Pro will get you there. If you are considering EX, last time I checked it was above $200, but they always have sales, like all the time. And their sales are really good. So what I did was I purchased the Pro version, and when the sale came out, I only had to pay like $100 more to get the EX version, which is an insane discount to get the full featured program. Pricing wise, like that is a huge advantage against Photoshop because their subscription service is ridiculous and it's also really complicated. Now, before we even dive into comparing the two programs, it's really important that you assess what it is that you do that you need from these digital programs. If you're an artist that needs a lot of features to edit photos, then yes, stick to Photoshop. But if you're an illustrator that likes to draw digitally directly onto the tablet and also paint, it would be very relevant to you because there are other programs that do that better than Photoshop. Believe it or not. The second key feature that makes Clip Studio Paint way better than Photoshop is its line control. There's a section under each brush where you can control its stabilization. That is a huge game changer because that means you can draw the smoothest lines, smooth like butter, which Photoshop is incapable of doing. In fact, it's quite common to download an extension that can have those stabilization features so that you can draw as smoothly as possible. Or you can achieve the same look if you draw in vector art. It can be a real pain and it's kind of complicated to handle, and it's just not drawing. It's not drawing. So I'm guessing that this is because Clip Studio Paint's history comes from the Manga Studio component. So for them, being able to draw digitally is extremely important. So it would make sense that they have drawing features that are super sophisticated. An extra cool thing about line stabilization is that even after you draw something, there's a feature where you can actually change the width of your lines, even after you've drawn it. And no, it's not even vector art. That in and of itself is really cool. The third advantage that Clip Studio Paint has over Photoshop is it has some really cool features in terms of layering. There are a few layer modes that Photoshop has that Clip Studio doesn't have, but there are also a few other layer modes that Photoshop doesn't have either. One of them is the reference layer. So you can basically set one layer to be the reference for another layer. And that's great when you're laying out flat colors or you're designating new lines for it. It can be really useful. It's hard to explain, but once you start using it, it's hard to get back to Photoshop and not be able to use any of these features, to be honest. The one feature that I really like that isn't that important, but I enjoy it, is you blue the layer at, I'm not sure what the term is. You basically turn the entire layer blue, so it ends up looking like an under sketch. It's really useful when I want to ink on top of that drawing, and turning everything blue without having to go into the adjustment layers and changing the colors and all that. There's already a button for it. It's just super convenient, and I just love that they thought about that. When you use the program primarily for drawing, they would think about that. Now, does Photoshop think about that? They don't think about us drawing, you know? The last thing I'm going to mention that is really cool about Clip Studio Paint, the fact that there's a whole database of reference images. Within the program, you can access a cloud-based library of reference images, textures, effects, even clips of art that other people have uploaded. And you can even upload your own stuff. Just having those extra features to help you draw better, it's great. I've used the brick images, I've used textures, I've seen people make entire buildings out of these images, or even use the tones to add clouds to their comics. It's a very cool feature. This is probably coming from their past through Manga Studio, so I'm not surprised. I'm mostly just excited because Photoshop doesn't have that. They might have a fancy interface. I will say that it is a little bit overwhelming to navigate, especially since a lot of it is in Japanese, but I think free resources are great. Now, of course, nothing's perfect, so I will mention a few things that Clip Studio lacks, and it's probably important for you to consider before you jump on this wagon. The first and probably the most important thing about why Clip Studio Paint lacks in certain departments is that it's not meant for graphic designers. It really isn't. There's no text editing capabilities. Now, you can put text, and within the context of comics, it works, but other than that, you can't distort text. You can't do pretty much anything with text other than type it in whatever format you want it. But really the only way you can edit text is after you rasterize it, and what that means is that if you want to change the words or letters, you can't change it anymore. It is a little frustrating when you try to do more graphic designy things on it. The second thing that kind of sucks about Clip Studio Paint is it doesn't have a lot of brush file compatibilities. The neat thing about Photoshop is that it's pretty open with different brush files, but Clip Studio has a very specific type of brush files, which means that if you've already purchased lots of brushes that you're using on Photoshop, they're probably not going to be compatible inside of Clip Studio Paint. So yeah, if you are curious on downloading brushes for Clip Studio Paint, I would suggest checking out Brian Allen's brushes. They're great and compatible with Clip Studio. From what I need to do digitally, it's pretty perfect. And Photoshop has a ton of extra features, but they're also for other kinds of artists. So it's really important for you to understand, like, what do you do? What is it that you need to be able to get your ideas down? Now, if it's heavy on drawing and painting, I really recommend that you reconsider continuing to use Photoshop as your main art software, especially if you're on a tight budget. There really is no need for you to be spending a monthly fee on a program that isn't designed solely for you. And yes, Photoshop continues to be the #1 art software in companies, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon, and that's absolutely fine. It makes sense because these companies are switching from different kinds of artists all the time. They're dealing with graphic designers and illustrators, concept artists. It makes sense. But if we're talking just you in your studio by yourself, working on the next painting, drawing, or comic, just think about it. So that is just a sliver of why I decided to solely use Clip Studio Paint. Will I ever use Photoshop again? Most definitely. If I have made you just be self-aware about the tools that you use every day, that's great. It really took me to have to deal with this subscription thing for me to realize, like, I don't need this. This isn't for me. Now, if you are considering doing the switch, there are a ton of videos on YouTube on how to use the software. There's even videos on how to use it after using Photoshop. It is very common to do that switch. For now, thank you for listening to me talk on and on about how Clip Studio Paint is a pretty nifty software that really deserves a lot more praise and attention than it is right now. I know that there are artists out there that would like to not be changed to a subscription service. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Maybe even subscribe, because I'll continue to make more art and comic related videos. So until then, bye-bye!